So greetings, everybody. Take a deep breath and welcome this opportunity to be together in the presence of the Spirit and the Holy within, between, among us. And again, we welcome Jean, Susan's mom. And Jean, what's your last name?
Unmute. Okay, go ahead.
Jean Cassell.
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 Okay, because we have another Jean Ebersole with us here. We don't want any confusions.
Very common name.
So I took some notes on our assigned pages for today, but it's also our opportunity to say anything we want to say about the book from cover to cover, and also its impact on our own thinking, our own spirituality, our own sense of community, our sense of hope and engagement with the world, all of which are vital topics. Let's start with where we left off last week. He begins a lengthy chapter on democracy, and he uses a phrase from the Occupy movement. Do you remember the Occupy movement of a few years ago? This is what democracy looks like, was the shouted phrase on the streets during the Occupy movements around the world. When was that? 3 years, 4 years, 5 years? Occupy Wall Street, Occupy.
It was right after 08, so it was after the crash, wasn't it?
Oh, that's right. It was in response to the bank bailouts and so on. That's right. So it was a long time ago already. So he gives some examples. I'll just kind of cite them and you can comment on which ones interest you. The example of the town Torres in Venezuela, the town Porto Alegre in Brazil, the seven
plagues.
Okay, seven plagues. Yeah, it is plague. Okay, afflicting our tired old democracies. His conversation about everyday communism. Eleanor Ostrom, which was another view to Garrett Hardin's view, called The Tragedy of the Commons. An example from the late Middle Ages in Europe, an explosion of communal spirit, and the Alaska Permanent Fund. There was a lot in that chapter. What interests you?
Well, the Alaska Permanent Fund interested me in a couple ways. One is because some of you may know that I have ancestry in Norway. I have cousins in Norway. I've traveled there 3 times. Anyway, there have been big oil discoveries in the sea outside of Norway. And I've got a cousin who actually works on an oil rig, and they put together a fund, which you might have heard of, which helps to provide, funding for their government. They don't spend it all. And I just thought this was very admirable because I think in our high-level government, federal government, we have a tendency to overspend rather than to underspend. So I got to tell you, I must confess, I didn't know that our own Alaska had a permanent fund. So this was an eye-opener for me. And I think very positive.
I thought it was so interesting because Alaska is such a Republican state, and that they chose to do this, I find very fascinating.
I could only think of Sarah Palin standing on her porch, watching the money come out.
Yeah. I think I've told some of you, my mom was in a conversation with a woman at Cards one day, and she was going on and on about how people, welfare from the state, and, there was a conversation here about communism, and communism that we, is all around us in the form of kindness, et cetera. But this woman was going on about how she doesn't think people should get all these benefits. And my mom said, well, she said, I would never take them. And my mom said, well, are you on Medicare? She said, yeah. She said, well, yeah. You're pretty much taking them. You could always turn that down. So some things we don't, it's like you're saying, we didn't know about that. We don't know about it, or we start to take it for granted and it falls away, from our consciousness that we are, as a society, taking care of each other in many ways.
I wondered,
if Jane would talk a little bit about her experience with the Winnetka caucus system. It seems that there maybe are some correspondences there.
You had mentioned that earlier.
I was giving you a little
I'm
time to
not
think
sure.
about it.
Um,
Maybe not. I don't know.
I'm drawing kind of a blank. I'm not sure exactly where. It's not necessarily the most democratic institution, but it works in that from my point of view, I like it because it finds good people. So if I think of somebody who would be really good on school board, I can go to them and say, you would be really good on school board. And that person might be much more likely to run than they would if they had to mount a campaign to get themselves elected. And I just think it draws very thoughtful people in our government. So that's what I like about the caucus system. But I'm not sure exactly how it pertains to the ideas of democracy in this book, other than it's sometimes considered to be a closed system, but in reality, anybody who shows, who breathes a breath of air is qualified to serve on the caucus, and there's a slot for them because they just don't have enough people interested in serving. So
Well, we also always get our annual questionnaire to have the opportunity to put input into our various village boards. So that,
it does try to engage people that way, and it's a good educator too for people who just move to Winnetka and are interested in learning about government. It's a great way to learn about government. So at its best, people go to board meetings, they become educated in the board that they're either finding people to serve on, or that they're coming up for questions for the community to answer thoughtful questions about the directions for those various boards.
So I'm interested, what is the Winnetka caucus system? I've heard about it, but I really don't know what it is.
Well, it's a group of 60 volunteers in town who serve two functions. They put out an annual questionnaire and tabulate the results and come up with platforms. So Winnetka has 4 different branches of government. We pay our taxes to the village, the schools, the library, and the parks. So rather than one tax bill, we're paying 4. And the caucus manages those 4 governing boards in that they take it upon themselves to slate candidates for those offices by talking to people in town who they think would serve the town well in those functions. And so it kind of cuts the campaigning end of serving in an office and goes directly to serving. I find that my experience with it is that they find really good people to serve on boards by and large. So the caucus then slates people, and the slated candidates come before the caucus is divided into committees. So if you're on the school committee, you're slating the schools, but then you as a 60-member person of this group vote on the other 3 boards as well. And then that's the first level of approval. Then the second level of approval is there's a town meeting where everybody gets to put input into the candidates and vote on them. And the third level is the general election. So any person who served, Susan was on the park board for a while. Susan Snyder was on the park board. And she went through those three steps. She interviewed with the caucus, was slated to run, was voted on by the 60-member caucus after she was slated for the park board, and then ran in a town election too. But by and large, if the caucus is doing its job in finding a balance of candidates and good good candidates, the candidates run uncontested. And Kelly was in a situation, interestingly enough, from our church as well, where she was not reslated for school board, and people were pretty much up in arms. The school committee that year, from my point of view, didn't do their homework. They didn't do a good job. And so Anne was reslated at the town meeting and was then served as a school board member, continued to serve as school board member. So it has checks and balances along the way, which are needed in a democracy from my point of view. So that's caucus in a nutshell.
Well, thank you, Jane. I did not know all that. Appreciate it. There's, the word democracy assumes that it's the people rule, but there's different kinds of democracies. Sounds like this is an effort, a tradition that brings democracy closer to the average citizen and encourages their involvement. But most of our democracy in the United States is a representative democracy. It's not really people getting together to make decisions. It's people sending elected representatives who make decisions together. But this sounds a little bit more like an effort to involve more people. Have you heard of this? Go ahead, Jean.
I was just going to say that sort of reminds me of this idea of the People's Parliament and the budget participatory
I love that.
process.
Yeah.
I remember something like that years ago in the US. There was, when people were talking about the budgets, where they brought folks together and had them unpack the federal budget and then try to go through how they might do it. And I loved how that increased citizenship and ownership amongst communities. I thought that was very interesting.
Well, there actually is participatory budgeting in Chicago. They waited until I moved from the city to start it, but I know at least in Rogers Park and maybe other wards in the city, the alderman is given a certain amount of money to basically turn over to the people to decide at a public meeting what the priorities are within that ward and specific projects to spend money on in that ward. And I think Chicago is even mentioned very briefly in the book. And I don't know if it's every ward or just some wards. And I don't know any other examples in the country, in the United States, where participatory budgeting is practiced. There are probably some other examples. Does anybody else know of any?
I think the state of Oregon, many years ago, did that.
Mm-hmm. What else in this section on this is what democracy looks like interests you all? I thought about Andrew Yang as I read the Alaska Covenant Fund. His one and only platform was, let's give everybody $1,000 a month, right? $1,000 a month? Not a year, a month, I think.
A month, yeah.
And I think his viewpoint was public money is the people's money, so let's give it to them. Let's trust people to have that intrinsic motivation to get out and make their lives better with this investment in the entrepreneurial spirit of the average citizen.
You wonder if that could be done effectively in a microcosm somewhere in the US, other than Alaska. I mean, we didn't know about Alaska. Obviously, that's helpful, but maybe in Detroit, in the city limits, or in Chicago, or.
Yeah, I think there have been some pilots, but I'm going on very thin information somewhere in my brain about that. I think some urban areas in the United States have tried this, but
I think it'd be a great character test on individuals to give people money. It'd be a wonderful character study. See what they did with it.
Mm-hmm.
It can also be philanthropic in that people who, have garnered great wealth on their own, out of their own initiative, give back to their communities in many, many ways.
Yes, some people wouldn't need that $1,000 a month to start their own business, but they might see somebody else who needs some help, either a charitable institution or a neighbor or something like that. Maybe someone else's business is going to take $2,000 of capital per month to get it going. So another neighbor could share that with them. There were a lot of people, each time, you know, during a recession, each time the government just gives people money, like happened this year with our $1,200 checks per person. Each time there are people who say, I don't need this money. And then there are some news how they've used that money to benefit their extended family or their neighbors. Did any of you see those stories earlier this year?
Trying to do it ourselves.
Well, I work on the board of Learn Charter Schools, and several of the actually younger kids that were in college and whatnot that had worked for Learn must have communicated with each other, but they sent me their checks on behalf of, and they asked for me to deploy them on behalf of Learn. So, and I thought that was really sweet. I mean, you know, they were in college and they were getting student loans, and they just felt that their people were more in need of it. So that was nice.
Wow.
So that was very sweet. It made me feel like, wow, what did I do with mine? We also had a situation where we got my husband's father passed away, and we got his stimulus check, although he had passed away. So then we were left with the moral dilemma of do we deserve that or not? So here we are holding that check. And meanwhile, in the mail, I receive very generous donations. So yes, and we were exhibiting both ends of it. You know, do we deserve this money over here? And I kind of wanted to hang on to it for a different reason, perhaps. And at the same time, people were generously giving us their checks. So, and I think more people might have done that had they, you know, been spurred to do that.
I'm looking at his 7 plagues here, which aren't really plagues. They're more like shifts. From polarization to trust, from exclusion to inclusion, from complacency to citizenship, from corruption to transparency, from self-interest to solidarity, from inequality to dignity.
Mhm.
Any reflection on any of those shifts?
A lot of,
The corruption to transparency especially jumped out at me, whether it's corruption or it could just be just transparency itself. You know, we had spoken in a previous session about there are those, well, like Jean had mentioned, there are those people who think, well, our government shouldn't give money or any help to other people, let them pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Well, part of what I agree with some of these folks is the money isn't always spent well or efficiently. There can be waste. And so that can be a point of agreement, I think, amongst everyone. And if we had more transparency about all types of processes, whether it's, you know, finding candidates, spending money,
Yeah.
you're reallocating money, I think we could come together more.
right, you can agree that you don't want a child who is suffering, you know, without food, but you also don't want abuse of the food stamp system. So you could go on either end of that, but somewhere you have to hold the one value of you don't want someone without food in our country as the baseline, I guess, and then try to find a compromise from there.
It's interesting because some people, I think, don't necessarily feel that things are transparent when they indeed could be, if you look. And I think it's a matter of trust sometimes.
One of the things I found emboldening kind of at the end of this was sort of the idea of having courage. You know, we moved from, you know, homo puppy to homo economicus to homo cooperans, right? So get out there and cooperate and try to, you know, move forward. And I think many times, I'll speak for myself, I feel myself like walking away from the table. It's so big, it's so unwieldy that you
Yeah.
just, you can't tackle it. So a problem like what you're speaking about, Diane, it's a big issue to tackle, but you'd have to get in there and pull it apart, peel the onion, start somewhere. And Susan, I think with Learn, you guys have done that. You said, okay, well, we can say all we want about charter schools, and we can go up and down about that, but we're still going to throw this starfish in. We're going to go for it. And these lives will be changed, and we can continue having the broader discussion.
And that's certainly what we're trying to do, I think, with Bethel Baptist, to be in contact and find out about people whose experience has been very different from ours, what that's like. And then, you know, how do they shine the light on us, and how do we shine the light on them?
You know, and a lot of this goes back to education. You know, I'm thinking about, you know, this really is a big thing we're talking about, but if children and teenagers and young adults have experiences, not just book learning, but experiences where they can learn about, like Jane said, a lot of the information is out there. We're just not educated, or we don't know where to look for it. And then we can add to it. So it's just interesting to me how, in my opinion, a lot of it goes back to how we are educated and how we continue to educate ourselves and others.
And engage too.
Yeah.
Engagement along with the education, I think.
The cynicism, excuse me, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say one of the big issues, at least while my involvement with the charter school movement that I'm involved with, is back to that transparency issue, is having complete accountability for where the, where the money is being spent and why it's being spent. And I think when you get into these larger bureaucracies or school systems like Chicago Public Schools, while that information probably is out there, it's just in these huge bundles of money, and it's hard to know where did the special ed fund actually go. It was $30 million, and what kids were actually helped, or whatever it was, right? Because it's just so big, and it, to follow the dots all the way down to why didn't this school get special ed funding? It just takes so much time to figure it out. It's almost the scale of it. So, and I think that creates a lack of trust if there's not transparency. So,
Jan, you were going to say something about cynicism.
The cynicism to engagement part kind of struck me, as did the concept of content. I was thinking of my personal experience. I was in the Soviet Union right when Gorbachev was had come into power, and at a women's conference, was there for 2 weeks. And at the end of the conference, a woman who was a curator at the Kremlin Museum offered to take a few of us on a private tour of the museum. And I think there were six women that were still left whose flights didn't quite coordinate with the clothes. And after having this amazing tour of the museum, she invited us back to her house for soup. And I can remember distinctly this tiny, tiny little place and this wonderful soup that this woman had made, and she'd sent her daughter off to buy bread. But her comment was, 2 weeks ago, I thought you were my enemies, that you wanted to kill me, and now we share soup together. And so that experience just kept resonating for me as I was reading this chapter, and the importance of the ability to go from cynicism to engagement, and also the importance of contact.
Thank you.
Last week, Christy recommended the documentary, The Social Dilemma, on Netflix. I watched it. It was horrifying, enlightening and horrifying. So, years ago when I was working, we were doing a lot of that, or we were trying to get the data to tell us those sorts of things. But somewhere along the way, I missed the whole dialing, the architectural, engineering that's gone on with the data engineers, and how far that's come. And so it leads me to really think about how much we're manipulated into that cynicism by the things that we see or don't see in our feeds, and what we see and don't see in the news, and that kind of thing, which he gets into in the end, I think, in terms of his prescriptions for
Right.
how to live.
Don't watch the news.
Or not very much of it anyway.
Yeah.
Correct. I agree.
I've been in Idaho with my parents for 4 months, and probably one of the most healthy things, in addition to being with my parents, is we just really don't watch the news. But we read a lot, we talk a lot about things, you know, and my mom and dad have a great perspective. They've lived through a lot. So, but it's helped my blood pressure go down. I mean, so.
That's one of his 10 rules to live by. We'll definitely need to save some time to get to those.
Yeah.
His conversation about communism interests me because I've been a student of Marxism when I was in college and seminary. And it seems to me that I've heard this argument he mentions on page 307, that back when the United States was involved in what was regarded as an existential struggle with communism, Marxism, Leninism, the Soviet Union and China, I remember being told by somebody that communism doesn't work because it's based on an incorrect assumption about human nature. I remember being told that, and I nodded and said, I guess that makes sense, I guess. And, you know, the more I thought about it over the years, I think communism failed more because Marxism, Leninism is based on the heavy hand of the state, which becomes sort of the most distant kind of brutal taskmaster. And what Marx had in mind was that the state would be a placeholder for just a brief period of time, sort of holding the hands of the people until the people were able to exercise their own economic liberty without the heavy hand of the state, and the state would actually wither away, was Marx's general view. But once you hand over all power, political, economic, ideological, to a state, game over. Anybody who dares to think any way contrary to the state is sent to the gulag. So I think that's why communism failed, not necessarily because it was sort of based on a flawed understanding of human nature. Because I think really if people are given freedom, real freedom to be creative, they'll use creativity for the good. I would really like to agree with Bregman. So I think a better term than communism is communalism. And I don't know if you've ever heard that term. It sounds so much like communism that it'll never fly. But a lot of academics do use the term communalism. It means to live one's life in a way that's fully invested in one's community, in the welfare of society. And I think Bregman's point here is that we are more communal than we want to admit. Even the marketplace itself, the free marketplace, the stock market or Target, or it's a meeting of people. It's a meeting of buyers and sellers. So it's a networking. Likewise, any political party, any church, any neighborhood association, any bowling league, it's where people meet together because they can do more together than they can by themselves. So a bunch of sellers without buyers doesn't work. A bunch of buyers without sellers doesn't work. You need you need that common public square where all this activity, intellectual activity, economic activity, all gets mixed together. But the state really needs to kind of have a light touch on all these marketplaces of ideas and things. To have a heavy hand becomes too much. To have no hand is probably not a good idea either. But he could have written a whole book on communalism. I think he just kind of whets our appetite here.
In some ways he did, though, because he starts with the hunter-gatherer societies, right, that were communally based. and nomadic, but then the hierarchy came in, you know, and it all went to hell in a handbasket. Is kind of what
Yeah, I remember in Zimbabwe learning the history of Zimbabwe as taught by a Black majority government, which replaced the white minority government in 1980. The perspective of the Black nationalist government was, we've been communal since as far back as there have been people in this part of the world, in Southern Africa. And the communalism in Southern Africa is proven by everyone's memory that somewhere back in time, there was no private property, and anybody who had cattle could graze those cattle anywhere. And then along came the white settlers who said, oh no, we need nice, neat dividing lines, and said, this is where the Black people are, and this is where the white people are. This is where the farmers are. This is where the ranchers are. And they started building fences, just like in the American West. You know, the farmers versus the ranchers, the farmers versus the cowboys.
It's Oklahoma, you know.
And in Zimbabwe, this was used as an example of how at root, we are basically a sharing society. And that's why we need to always act for one another's welfare. I mean, that was kind of the main point that the Black nationalist government was trying to make. Of course, it was in their interest because they were trying to create a more socialist state. But they were appealing to that day before the whites came, before the British came, when everybody shared everybody's land, because that's the only way you can graze your sheep and your cattle.
That's what our Native Americans did here too before. They believed that it was Mother Earth. They didn't plow and cut mother's breast. They didn't divide it up. They could hunt anywhere. They could raise their crops anywhere. That was part of their idea, that the earth belonged to everybody.
Right. So there isn't a mine and a yours. I mean, there might be on paper, but ultimately it's ours.
And to add to what Jean said, that the Native Americans also cared so much about the future, that we are taking care of this place now, so it will be in good shape for, I don't know what they say, 7 generations or something.
Shall we press onwards? He has his next major section here is the turning the other cheek.
Mm-hmm.
And that section included the story of the social worker Julio Diaz and his mugging experience. Tea with Terrorists, the Norway prison, the 1965 US Crime Commission, the research of James Q. Wilson from Harvard, and what came out of that, the broken window theory, over policing, the police Commissioner Bratton, is it James Bratton? I forget, Bratton anyway. And then how his theory was debunked, and the Dutch approach to terrorism. He covers a lot in 100 pages.
really did. Mm-hmm. Well, the brothers and Mandela, there was so much good in there.
Yeah, that's even after that. There's then the North Dakota correctional facilities who visit that prison in Norway.
Mm-hmm.
And then a very long discussion of the 2 Afrikaner brothers in South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And the 2 American researchers, Gordon Allport and his student Pettigrew. And the example of Nelson Mandela himself.
I had heard that idea before of the, one negative is more powerful than 10 positives, tied to advertising. Mm. That, a negative experience with a brand corrodes that brand because you'll tell 10 people about it or 5 people about it rather than it only happens to you. But I hadn't really extrapolated that out to the degree that he does about how that impacts people, their negative experience with another person. If they say something that hurts you in some way, how that, the impact of that. And how difficult then that makes all this communicating and seeing of the other that we've been talking about.
In a youth group at a church where I was a pastor, we had a rule that if you tore somebody down, we called that a tear down, you had to give them 2 build-ups in response.
There is so much truth to that. You know, the negative and positive, I think of it often in terms of thinking of Americans in Europe and how one blatant rotten American makes the impression for 10 good ones, 10 good Americans who Europeans would never even realize were Americans. You know, they just sort of fade in to the woodwork, but the one bad one sticks out as American and makes that impression for everybody else.
Yeah, a lot of that was, this chapter was sort of smoothed over with the veneer theory again. People are bad, negative things, you know, they will be negative if given the chance. You know, the prisons, especially the theories around how prisons are run.
Oh.
That was incredible to read about the Norway prison, that basically it's a school for how do you behave in society in ways that are going to get you rewards from society instead of punishments from society. And it certainly makes sense to me.
The whole idea of restorative justice is so strong there. It's pretty exciting. I hadn't realized that about Norway.
I wrote down that quote, "We're releasing neighbors every year."
Mhm.
Right.
That's a neat.
Yeah, it was very powerful, I thought.
Right. Well, almost everybody who goes to prison comes out. So
And becomes our neighbor.
exactly, somebody's neighbor. Yeah, right.
And doesn't go back into prison.
Well, you hope not. A few years ago, 60 Minutes had this powerful segment on the prison system in Germany and how humane it is. And it's very, very similar to the Norway story. And I don't know if it's all of Germany or if this was like a model prison or maybe one state in Germany, but it was very powerful. I suppose somebody could look it up and see it. But yeah, it's just treating people humanely. You're more likely to get humane people as a result of that.
One of my cousins in Norway said something along the line, this was several years ago, you know, when a young person gets in trouble, our approach is they're a young person, they've got time to learn. It's not such a big deal as I hear can take place in your country.
Mhm.
It's about trust too, trust.
The brain isn't totally developed until age 25 or so.
Reminded me of that section made me think of the gentleman who came in and spoke to us on the last book, Jeffrey, from the, was it Englewood or?
Lawndale.
Lawndale, the Lawndale project, that their idea was smaller is better, and community policing in the most positive sense of community policing to deal, like you're saying, Diane, with the young people who made a mistake and, you know, can be molded within the society of Lawndale rather than sent into the system. We're not going to support them.
With a whole variety of social services, as I remember it in that talk.
Yeah.
We have a long way to go there in terms of improving. I mean, not only how we treat people in prison, but when they get out of prison, making way for them and helping them get in a track off. I mean, even in terms of just getting a job right now with a prison, with a felony record, it's really tough. And we need to get away from that, I think. big time.
I asked our daughter who works for Best Buy, would Best Buy hire someone who is out of jail or prison? And she said, absolutely, yes. Best Buy has
Oh.
a commitment to that sort of community involvement.
Wow, that's encouraging.
Restoration.
And do they hire felons, violent crime felons, or people who have stolen, like white collar felons or drug? Do you know what distinctions they make, if any?
I don't know that, but I do know that the crew my daughter works on, that's a lot of mixed ethnicities there.
Mhm.
So, there's a place for people like my daughter who didn't choose to go to college to find employment, and maybe their record has a few black marks on it, but Best Buy will give them a chance.
Great.
That's exciting. That's really good
On
to hear,
the other
Nancy.
hand, environmentally, there's nothing in a Best Buy store that isn't going to end up in a landfill at some point in the future. So, you go, ay, yay, yay.
Anything about the policing comments? He gets into the issue of the broken windows theory, and Commissioner Bratton over policing, sort of the theory that if you get if you catch people doing low level crimes, you will prevent them from doing worse crimes later, I think is the basic philosophy that Bratton brought. And it was widely embraced, and now it's being questioned. It has, he speaks specifically on page 339 to the racial implications of that kind of a policy.
Yeah, that struck me. It was kind of mixed up with the other reading that we've been doing,
Yes.
about, being anti-racist, or the caste system. It was embraced for certain reasons, possibly. In addition to this idea of the theory, people took the theory and then used it as a means to get elected and change that. But it also, I thought, was an example of what gets measured gets done. So they were measuring the number of arrests, they were measuring the small things, and measuring the other big, the bigger crimes in a negative way, so that, pushes, you get the unintended consequences of people meeting the goals you set out for them.
Well, do I remember right in these pages, they were saying that it had an opposite effect, because if you're trying to prove that catching the low level offenses will prevent the higher level offenses, then when the higher one comes, it kind of works against your theory. So you don't even go after
Right.
the more serious crimes. And it's the more serious crimes that have the most serious consequences for individuals and society. So I don't know, it'd be very interesting to have a law enforcement professional or academic read on these pages with us. I know the police training issue is a very lively one right now. It's actually a lively issue in my county for the last 5 years. My church in Lombard was trying to get our local police in Lombard to adopt CIT training, which was de-escalation training, especially for police who come into contact with people with having a mental illness episode, basically. But de-escalation training is broader than that. It's approaching anybody who's agitated. It could be a domestic violence situation, or just somebody who, when a uniformed police officer shows up, it can often escalate the emotions in the situation immediately. So police need special training to kind of address the emotions of the person and try to calm them down upon first contact rather than tone of voice, body posture. It requires so much training. And some of the police were very interested in this in DuPage County, and other police took great offense. And they said, we are already doing so much training. You know how much of our budget, how much of our time goes to training? It's training, training, training. And now here's these do-gooder Christians saying we need more training. I'm not
They
sure.
may be the ones who need it most.
maybe so. Is this where they said how little training American police officers have compared to
Yeah, comparatively.
19 weeks versus 2 years.
page 341?
Mm, right.
Again, I'm out of my knowledge base here, but doesn't stop me from having an opinion.
That was the other quote. That was the other quote I wrote down. The woman prison warden in North Dakota who said, "I'm not a liberal, I'm just practical."
Right.
You know, it's like, well, I want to do what works. You know, I'm going to go with the evidence and see what happens. I like that. Mhm.
Well, in our August study, talking about Brian Stevenson's book, we talked about some of the models around the country where they're trying to send in mental health professionals when there's a mental health crisis, rather than just sending the police every time.
Mhm.
And that's not only more effective and humane, it's also cheaper, because mental health professionals don't cost as much as your average police officer and don't have to come equipped with all that stuff, all that gear and all that stuff. So I think there are places where left and right views of problems can come together.
Mhm.
And where any public official, their ears should perk up when you say, and this will be cheaper too. It's like, what about the Dutch approach to terrorism? I thought that was interesting. The next page. 3.
Nerds and tea.
My heart breaks when and this has not been so a few years back, when I read about these young people who leave the United States to become terrorists in the Middle East. And I was heartened to find that there's a little tiny way to intervene, maybe by saying, we care about you, we're offering you this cup of tea, but more than that, we're going to find a way to support you as a person. And well, thank you. And even more powerful was the when the skinheads come to a certain town in I think this was
It was in Germany, wasn't it? Or
Germany. Yeah.
it wasn't.
Yeah, it's the burial place of, is it Rudolf Hess or what?
Uh-huh. Yes, yes, absolutely right.
Mhm.
That the citizens there have a way of kind of turning it around and intervening, and maybe even helping some of them recognize that they don't want to have extreme negative views.
Mhm.
So the last section for today, before we got to the 10 rules to live by, is about the soldiers in World War I and Christmas 1914. How many of you had heard that story before in some form? I read it in a preacher's like illustrations for sermon book. And many, many years ago, I think my first church 40 years ago. And I used that, at some December sermon. And then later, I thought I heard that it wasn't true at all. And I thought, oh, well, I'm glad I'm not at that church anymore. They're not going to accuse me of making things up. But he seems to say, it's more true than I thought it was. It wasn't just, I thought it was just like one group of British and German soldiers. He's saying that it happened all up and down the front, the Christmas of 2014, 1914, and it even continued surreptitiously after Christmas Eve, 1914. So I feel vindicated by telling my story in a sermon.
And that then that was used sort of as an idea to in the Colombian jungle was fascinating.
Yeah, I had never heard that. No.
That I had never heard.
Mhm.
Dropping those Christmas trees and those notes from the mothers. Wow.
Yeah, I guess that's advertising for good. So,
Yeah,
social media, using your powers for good rather than evil.
yeah. That whole section ends with a quote, "The more you give, the more you have." That should be a church's financial stewardship campaign slogan.
Well, the other thing I think that was very strong there was also the farther from the front line, the stronger the hatred.
Yeah, I thought that was,
And the willingness to stand your ground when you're not the person who's standing face to face.
He makes a blunt statement on page 377, humans are not wired for war.
Yeah.
I believe that very, very strongly.
there too.
Well, that came out earlier too, when he was talking about the training, right? How the training had to be ratcheted up to get soldiers to shoot.
It was statistics of the Civil War about how few of the guns were actually fired. I thought that was
I
amazing.
thought that was,
Mhm. Anything else in that section you want to reflect on?
Well, on 362, he was talking about interacting with strangers is something we have to learn.
Mhm.
It's okay to retain your identity, but eliminate your prejudices.
Mhm. Yeah, last week we spent some time talking about the importance of foreign exchange student programs and just other programs like Jan mentioned, where people actually meet people who all they had was some vague, sometimes negative stereotypes of, and then they just meet them and those stereotypes are challenged right away. You know, I read something about Iran this week about what's really, I know, it was in the Christian Century, an article by a researcher in global religion. And he said Iran has a very high percentage of people who don't believe in God at all. It's like, what? Iran? And he said only 30% of the population is Shia Muslim. And Shia Islam is the guiding philosophy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's only 30%, and the rest are other kinds of Muslims or non-believers, and a very small percentage, even today, of Christians in Iran. It's just, you just think Iran, you think radical Shia Muslims, the Ayatollahs and so on. It's far more complicated than that. And there are a lot of people in Iran who are just fed up with the Ayatollahs and who are seeking, eventually to have some other kind of guiding philosophy in their government, which means that at the end of the day, your average Iranian probably isn't much different than your average you and me and everybody else. And that's not our common assumption when we hear any news about Iran. So I think that kind of perspective could be repeated country after country after country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see so many people, thinking about the last 4 years and the next 4 years, that there are whole groups of people who feel that they will have to operate, right, under a regime that is not what they believe in. and will go about their business, will drive to work, will, you know, kind of live their lives, and yet feel like you're saying in Iran, they're encumbered by, you know, something that's operating their government that's not necessarily what they believe in.
I've heard this quote by Mark Twain before: travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness.
And I wonder too if
Agreed.
opportunity doesn't expand on that word travel. I was talking about Iran. In the church I was serving in Northrop, we adopted an Iranian family that were refugees, and I happened to be related to a dental specialist and told who was from Iran. And he said, you know, as soon as you can get them here, I'll do all their dental work. And the next thing I know is we were there for their dental work, and he had recruited an Iranian physician to do a physical, and on and on and on, so that these folks had a really excellent care. And what made the difference was that contact and that exposure. And of course, their willingness to take the first step. But once they took the first step, these folks had what they needed.
And I think Jean pointed out, Jean Ebersole pointed out at the bottom of that same page 362, that he makes an interesting point that contact with others requires a strong sense of self for both parties.
Mm-hmm.
That's my phrase: strong sense of self, a sense of self-identity, like knowing who you are.
Mm-hmm.
If you're representing a church, if you're representing a country, if you're representing whatever, an industry or whatever, you really need to know the ins and outs of who you are. And I've sat around the table of a lot of interfaith dialogues where it seems like everybody at the table knows quite a bit about their religion except the Christians. Who are kind of tongue-tied when it comes to like, what are your major holidays, and why do you do that communion thing, and what's that whole, when the priest puts their hand on the baby's head with water, what is that?
Beats the bris, that's for sure.
That to have, I think his point is to have authentic encounter,
Yes,
interaction
I
with another
understand.
person, you need to have some substance about your own, whatever it is you're representing, yourself, your community, your religion, whatever.
But Jeffrey, can I say yes, and going back
Please.
to what Nancy said of the, you know, the terrorists with T, you know, these young men who don't necessarily have their identity all sussed out, but are missing a sense of belonging and respect that maybe you help give in the absence of that, so that they aren't radicalized, you know, or a person is not ossified in a negative space. Maybe both exist in tension.
Indeed, thank you. So let's move on to the 10 rules to live by. I want to have just a little time at the end for a quick wrap up.
I'm kind of sad Junia's not here.
Yes, and by the way, she wanted to be here and said we should somehow carry on without her, and
Yeah.
She'll watch us on the YouTube.
Because it's very much like the benediction, which I know she loves, the old benediction.
So any reflections on these 10 rules to live by? We talked about the news.
I enacted that one the last 2 days. I was overwhelmed. I don't watch television, but I usually listen to NPR. I did not listen. I did not read. I feel more relaxed. I feel good. Now, I don't want to live under a rock.
Right.
So I want to, you know, be informed, but I do need to take a break occasionally.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. He suggests, you know, taking a magazine or newspaper on, you know, a Sunday kind of paper, which tends to go a little bit deeper, you know, because the headlines we get what do the headlines mean and where does it all come from and all that. And kind of going deeper in some feature articles and some in-depth background kind of pieces. Because if you watch anything, CNN, Fox, whatever, you're going to get the same headlines minute after minute after minute. And that's just the first hour, you know.
Mhm.
And the same images too. And images are just as powerful as the words and ideas. And
What
also,
did you guys think about the platinum rule versus the golden rule? From a theological perspective.
yeah, I had heard this platinum rule many, many years ago in a book by Len Sweet. And then he teaches at Drew Theological Seminary. He recommends that as a lead for churches doing ministry in their communities. And I had never heard it before or since until I saw Bregman's citation of it here. I think it's very challenging that sometimes we think we know what people want based on our own experiences, and that may not be true.
That giving of freedom to determine their own, what's good for them. He seems to be suggesting.
And as a former missionary, I have some training in trying to work with people you're trying to help in such a way that really they take the lead rather than you, the moneyed, white, foreign, expert helper person, and really working with, in a sense of partnership and collegiality with your partners, and really ultimately letting them take the lead, even if it's sort of resources that come from your side of the world. There are two books. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of them. When Helping Hurts. Have you ever heard of this book, When Helping Hurts, and Toxic Charity? Two books with the same kind of bent. It's that so many people rush in to help without taking a moment to ask, is this what you want? Which is patronizing, which is wasteful, which maintains the power dynamic that, you know, I'm in charge and you're here to be charged. And when I was a missionary, we worked hard to not be the great white hope, but to really be in partnership with the people we're serving.
We've been talking about that a lot on the anti-racism thing that, you know, we're trying to get started about. We need to be humble, and we're going to mess this up because you know, just of that tendency to want to lead, to, you know, come to action, to do it the way we do it, kind of like we were talking about in prayer group, Nancy, of, you know, we may need to pray differently. We're going to have to figure out how to dance in a different way, more than likely, in order to be effective.
What do you make of his distinction between empathy and compassion? I struggle with that. I guess I just don't quite see the distinction the way he does.
I agreed. But I think the real point is that he says, your empathy can lead you to being overwhelmed and anxious, while your compassion will give you energy. And so I think it's helpful if you, and I'm sure you
do you guys remember the women's retreat? Sarah did a whole thing on compassion, because it is hard to figure that out.
fill me in more on that, Jean. I think I was there, but I forget.
That's what I was trying to look for my notes, because in COVID, we have lots of time to look through every file and clean offices, right, Susan? And I kept some of the stuff on compassion because I thought, gosh, this is really hard.
And while you're looking for that, at the bottom of 387, which is I think what Nancy was getting at, is to give an example. As a parent, you're not going to crouch in a corner of the room and whimper alongside your son or daughter, empathy. Rather, you try to calm and comfort them, compassion. So you remain a separateness while, reminding ourselves who we are. We are a separate being rather than trying to jump into the other person's heart and tears at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm sort of remembering from a few years ago that it was the other way around. You needed to be empathetic rather than just sympathetic, which is sort of it's an interesting shift.
Yeah, sympathetic gets worse press even than empathy. Sympathy is the idea of feeling pity for, almost like at a distance. It's like, poor thing, I'm sure glad I'm not you.
That's exactly, yeah.
That must be really terrible being you right now. Can I go now? And empathy is really feeling with, but I'm going to hold out for empathy here, and I think empathy is necessary to make a connection with somebody. And I guess anything can run off the rails and detract you from needed next steps. But if you don't really walk in another person's shoes emotionally, I don't know that you're really doing the kind of connecting, heart-to-heart connecting that you need to. Of course, it doesn't stop there. I think you do have to pull back and say, okay, what's next for both of us here? Which is where you start to, I don't know, think more constructively about how to move forward.
Yes, and what I found here is it's kind of what you're saying, Jeffrey, that the empathy is the sitting with their individual feelings, and then compassion is maybe a little bit more active to relieve the suffering, to see it and help to move. I can send you guys this if you want, which was her 12 fast facts on the art of compassion. If you don't.
When was that, Jean? Was that Sarah Walker Cleveland days?
Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We need to do that again. There's so much just joy in being together on that up at the St. Mary's Seminary grounds.
And maybe we could do a virtual retreat. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Jeff said something the other day about a retreat, a women's retreat. I don't remember what he was saying, but he was saying something about it. So it's not a forgotten past only event.
Yeah.
Right.
We've got 5 minutes. He does make this point that we shouldn't just hide our lights under a bushel, but not use false humility to keep others from seeing our good, because our good inspires other people's good. I think that's well spoken. Nobody wants to be thought of as a braggart, but I don't think you're being a braggart when you allow your college to list you as in your giving category to the college. I just think you're adding your voice to all the other voices that say, yes, this college is worth supporting. Please join me. Maybe we should all list all givers to the church by their giving level. I'm kidding. Slightly. Can we do a summary here in a couple of minutes? At the beginning of this month, we set out a number of objectives. Tell me, how did we do? To explore the personal, intellectual, spiritual, and social themes of the book. Examine how these themes inform our views of ourselves, the groups to which we belong, our society, and the common good. consider how these themes speak to our spiritual lives. I remember the first couple of weeks we talked several times about what's assumed to be the basic Christian view of human nature, which is original sin, and how this kind of book puts that, it interrogates that assumption. And lastly, build community among those who attend. How'd we
Yes, I feel communal with you all.
do? You communalist. One of the questions I like to pose at the end of a book's discussion is if the book was really transformative, did it really change us? I would say this book was highly transformative for me. In the last 3 years, I have become a spiritual companion or spiritual director. And a lot of the thinking in spiritual direction is that the holy dwells within us. And we need to just become more aware of the presence of the holy, not only in us, but in the world, in life, and so on. It's really a very positive view that everyone is that the likeness and image of the divine is present in every person. And that's a different message than original sin and
Oh, yeah.
hell for those who don't believe, in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and et cetera. It's a different vision. And this book for me helps me, it gives me courage and encouragement that there's someone else who's done some research behind this basic view of human nature that's behind a more robust, affirming spiritual view. So I'm grateful for this book, very grateful.
I love that it focused on the God who plays. Seemed to me that was an important concept to be reminded of.
I think the basic concept that human nature, humankind is basically good and caring, as opposed to the other view that we're all bloody and bloodthirsty and so forth. That basic concept has really changed my thinking as I've not finished the whole book, but it's a whole different way of looking at the world.
Yeah.
And if you start putting it into practice, it's pretty amazing. I like his thesis that being optimistic is realistic, not being realistic is pessimistic. And we tend to look at everything in negative terms so often. And this is a whole different point of view to listen to. And I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it. And I'm going to recommend it to the book group at my church.
Wow, right.
Wow.
I think I'll let my neighbors with cattle start grazing in my backyard.
I would build on that, Jean. I agree with you. I think I was falling into a more cynical, negative place that it's just not my typical, I think, who I am. I think I was being drawn away from that. And this helped me kind of turn back and not feel like by doing that, I'm being gullible and, I'm trying to be the light. Keep trying to be the light.
Like rule number one, to see the best in other people. I think I was brought up that way, but then somehow you kind of forget about that and you start seeing negative things. And if we can see positive, as your pastor was saying, that makes a whole lot of difference.
It really does. Mm-hmm.
My dad used to say to me, boy, I don't think he knew my name. Boy, if you treat other people nice, they'll treat you nice. And I think he lived that way. I thought it was kind of naive, but I think, of course, we always figure out by the time we're 60 that our parents were right after all. So.
I think those smaller communities, where people maybe just did have less contact, they practiced that and it worked.
You can get more with honey than you can with vinegar.
Yes.
So I want to thank you all for your participation.